Clara Holt had not spoken a full sentence aloud in days. That was how it often went. She moved about her cabin in silence, her voice left unused, her words gathering dust like the tools her husband had once swung with ease. The wooden boards creaked beneath her boots, the old rocker moaned when she sat, the kettle whistled its faint tune on the stove. Beyond the window, the corrals sagged in neglect, fences bent where storms had pressed them down. The cattle she once kept were long gone, sold off in the lean years after her husband was lowered into the earth on the ridge, beneath a cedar that stood like a lone sentinel. A decade had passed since that day, and in the time between, solitude had not grown lighter. It had only settled into her bones, like dust that could not be shaken free. She had thought she could carry it, and most days she did. There was no other choice. Yet the weight of absence was heavier in the evenings, when shadows grew long, and the rocking chair by the hearth reminded her of another presence, another life. Sometimes she imagined the chair moving, as though the wind might conjure the ghost of her husband, hat tipped low, eyes glinting with the old steadiness that once anchored her. But the rocker only swayed when she set it so, and the fire never spoke back. That autumn dusk, with clouds bruising the horizon and a sharpness in the air that promised rain, Clara spotted movement at the edge of her land. She thought at first it was the wind shaking branches loose, or a stray horse from the distant range. But the shape resolved into a rider swaying in the saddle, his horse staggering under his weight. Behind him walked a girl, or no, a young woman, her steps weary, her dark braid swinging against a shawl too thin for the season. Clara stiffened at once. Her hand twitched toward the rifle mounted by the door, though she did not take it down. She knew the look of their features, Apache. In town, such a sight would send whispers spiraling faster than wildfire. On the borderlands, suspicion was habit, and old grievances lay closer to the surface than buried roots. The rider slumped, nearly falling from the horse, and the sister caught at his arm, steadying him with strength beyond her size. Clara's first instinct was to close the shutters, bolt the door, retreat back into her silence. She owed them nothing. To invite them in was to invite danger. But as the rain began to fall, soft at first and then harder, she saw the exhaustion carved into their faces, the shadows beneath their eyes, and something in her chest ached. Her loneliness, long pressed down and folded away, rose like a tide. It pushed against her refusal, against the voice that told her she must remain untouched by strangers and their burdens. Before she could name her own decision, she was already stepping forward, her shawl clutched at her throat, her boots sinking in the wet earth. "Bring him inside," she said, her voice rough with disuse. The younger woman blinked in surprise, then nodded once. Together they eased the rider down and led him toward the cabin. Clara held the door open, the smell of wood smoke and coffee spilling out into the rain. Inside, the air grew heavy with their presence. The man sagged into a chair, his skin pallid with pain, his wound poorly wrapped. The sister stood close, eyes sharp with both gratitude and suspicion, as though she expected Clara's kindness to dissolve at any moment. Clara ladled coffee into tin cups, set them before her guests without ceremony. The hiss of the stove filled the silence. Rain tapped at the shutters like a restless visitor who refused to leave. She sat opposite them, her back straight, her hands folded tight in her lap. She did not ask questions. Neither did they. Words were unnecessary, the tension spoke louder than speech. But Clara felt it then, the ghosts of her house stirring. Her husband's rifle loomed above the hearth, a sentinel and a warning. In the cedar chest against the wall lay the wedding dress she had once pressed smooth with eager hands, now yellowing in folds of memory. The long years without a man's shadow in this cabin pressed close, reminding her of what had been taken and what had never returned. The strangers said little, yet their silence was not empty. It pressed against her solitude, reshaped it, made her aware of how fragile it was. She had believed her isolation to be solid stone, impervious to intrusion. But here they were, dripping rainwater onto her worn floorboards, changing the air with their mere presence. Clara lowered her eyes to her cup, but her heart thudded with a truth she did not wish to name, that her silence could be broken, and that within that breaking there might lie both danger and the faint tremor of something else entirely. The days settled into a strange rhythm. Clara rose early, as always, stoking the stove while the grey light stretched thin across the horizon. She expected the strangers to remain still, to linger as burdens, but they did not. The man, who at last told her his name was Takoda, moved with quiet purpose even in his weakness. His sister, Ahyv, kept close to him, her watchful eyes softening only when he rested. Their presence was weight, yes, but it was not idleness. Word of them spread faster than the chill winds of October. Men rode past her homestead more often than before, their horses kicking up dust, their eyes narrowing at the sight of unfamiliar figures beneath her roof. Clara knew what was whispered, that she was foolish, reckless, perhaps even traitorous. It unsettled her, though she kept her face hard when the riders slowed at her gate, their greetings clipped and heavy with judgment. When they moved on, her heart would not still for a long while, beating fast as though she herself had done wrong. Memories she had long buried rose up in those restless hours. She remembered the night her husband had not returned from a cattle drive, the lantern burning low in the window until dawn showed her what she already knew, that he was gone. She remembered the talk of raids, of ambushes along the borderlands, of violence carried out under the banner of vengeance. It had been easier to let the lines blur, to tell herself that all Apaches were folded into those stories, faceless and distant. Now she lived with two under her roof, and the lines refused to remain so simple. Takoda's silence was not the silence of hostility. It carried weight, but not coldness. He rarely spoke, yet when he set himself to a task, it was with patient hands that seemed to honor what they touched. He repaired her broken gate, mending its hinge with careful precision. He took her dull tools, blades long neglected, and sharpened them until they gleamed as though new. Clara watched from the porch one morning, her sewing left idle in her lap, as he moved steadily through the work her husband once would have claimed. There was no boast in him, no glance to see if she approved. It was as though he worked to restore not just her tools, but something she had not realized was faltering within herself. Inside, the house shifted. Where once silence had pooled, there was now the faint hum of life lived side by side. Clara sewed by the hearth, Ahyv humming as she ground corn in a bowl, Takoda sitting with his back straight as he whittled a piece of wood smooth. The low sounds mingled, awkward echoes of what her home had once known. Boots by the door, the muted breath of a man laboring nearby. The familiarity cut as sharply as it soothed. It was Ahyv who startled her most. One evening, when the lamps were lit and the fire threw amber across the walls, the younger woman reached for Clara's hair without asking. Clara stiffened, but did not pull away. Ahyv's fingers were nimble, steady, weaving strands into a braid with quiet ease. Clara sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the fire, her throat tightening with something she could not name. No hand had touched her with such simple care since before widowhood. She had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be tended to be seen as more than a figure holding a household together through grit and loneliness. When Ahyv tied the braid with a thin strip of leather and stepped back, Clara's heart trembled. Warmth stirred, almost unbearably tender. Yet just as quickly, fear returned. What would her neighbors say if they saw this? What if kindness became a mark of betrayal, binding her to the very people her world had taught her to mistrust? And worse, what if sheltering them painted a target on her back, her home, her very name? The fire popped, sending sparks upward, and Clara felt caught between two truths. One was the life she had known, solitude, suspicion, a widow's unending watch. The other was the unfamiliar presence now filling her cabin, pressing warmth into spaces she thought forever cold. She did not know if she could carry both. She did not know if she was strong enough to choose. But as she touched the braid that lay against her shoulder, smooth and tight, she realized that some part of her had already begun to change. Healing, if it was to come, might demand she step across boundaries she had once sworn never to cross. Winter came without warning, sudden as a blade drawn in darkness. One evening the sky was only grey, the air sharp but bearable, and by morning the land was buried beneath a white so deep it swallowed the fences whole. Wind swept across the plains in long, howling currents that rattled the shutters and made the cabin groan in protest. Clara had lived through winters before, but never had she felt the walls close so tightly, never had she sensed the stillness between four souls bound by necessity rather than blood. The storm took what little remained of her provisions and stretched it thin. Dried beans and flour dwindled, the salt pork gone in days. She rationed carefully, the careful measure of a widow long used to survival, yet each bite felt heavier with responsibility. The stove could not be left to smoulder. Its fire needed feeding, always feeding, and still the chill crept in, settling in corners, slipping beneath shawls, stiffening her fingers as she worked. Clara remembered her husband's voice in such storms, low and calm as he told her to trust the snow would pass. She remembered the weight of his arm around her shoulders, the warmth of his body beside hers when the wind clawed at the windows. That memory now ached like a wound freshly opened, and she found herself turning from it, as though the thought alone might undo her. Yet it pressed closer each night, a reminder of how silence had become her only companion for too long. Takoda did not yield to the storm. Before dawn, she would hear him rising, pulling on his coat with movements stiff from his half-healed injuries. Through frosted glass she watched him outside, his figure outlined in the pale light of morning, his breath billowing white as he swung the axe. The sound of wood cracking rang sharp against the muffled silence of snow. He moved with steady purpose, though she knew the wound in his side still pained him. He split log after log until a small mountain of firewood rose against the cabin wall. She found herself watching too long, her sewing forgotten in her lap, as if his endurance carved a new shape against her loneliness. Inside, Ahyv wove her voice into the storm. She sang in her tongue, low, rhythmic, like a current running beneath the silence. Clara did not know the words, but she felt their weight, the strength they carried, as if the very walls were stitched tighter for it. The sound unsettled her at first, foreign and haunting, but soon she caught herself leaning into it, as though the music pressed courage into her own marrow. One night, the roof groaned under the heavy burden of snow. Clara's heart tightened at the sound, remembering tales of roofs caving, families buried in their sleep. Takoda heard it too. Without a word, he wrapped himself in his coat, stepped into the blizzard, and climbed to the roof with shovel in hand. Clara stood at the window, fear pressing in. Each gust of wind threatened to throw him down into the drifts below. His figure blurred in the swirling white until she could scarcely see him at all. Then his foot slipped. She saw him stagger, the shovel clattering, his hand clawing at the edge. Something in her broke free then, something she could not name. She threw her shawl over her shoulders and rushed out into the storm, boots sinking deep, snow biting at her face. Her hands caught his arm just as he threatened to fall. For a moment they clung together, wind shrieking around them, the storm blinding and merciless. Her shawl whipped against his chest, her grip tight with fear she had not allowed herself to feel in years. His eyes met hers, dark, steady, scarred by things she could not yet know. Not the eyes of an enemy, not the eyes of a savior, but the eyes of another soul carrying wounds that matched her own. They did not speak. Words would have been swallowed by the storm, meaningless against the roar. Yet something passed between them, unspoken and unbidden. Protection could be silent, unyielding, as steady as a hand held firm against the wind. When they climbed down at last, snow clinging to their coats, their silence was no longer the same silence that had filled the cabin before. It was heavier, but not empty. It was filled with something waiting, fragile, uncertain, yet alive. The weeks stretched long beneath the iron grip of winter. Snow pressed heavy against the cabin walls, and the air inside grew thick with a tension Clara could not quite name. Each day followed the same rhythm, fires stoked, water hauled, meals portioned with care, but beneath those ordinary tasks, unease coiled. Clara found herself watching Takoda more closely than she wished to admit. He worked without complaint, kept to his duties, yet there was a restlessness in him she could not ignore. Sometimes, when he thought himself unwatched, he would pace the length of the room like a caged animal, his eyes drawn to the door as though he ached for escape. She wondered if he was waiting for something, or if he harbored reasons for staying that had little to do with recovery. In town, whispers had already turned sharp. Men who once tipped their hats at her now passed with narrowed eyes, their greetings clipped, their wives keeping distance in church. Clara heard fragments when she lingered at the mercantile, fugitive, outlaw, dangerous. She kept her chin high, her answers curt, but she felt the shift like frost gathering on glass. The neighbors who had tolerated her solitude now seemed ready to mark her a traitor. Takoda seemed aware of it. His silences grew heavier. At night, when the fire dimmed, Clara sometimes caught him staring at the rifle mounted above the hearth, her husband's rifle, polished though unused, a relic of another life. At other times, when she opened her cedar chest to fetch thread or cloth, she noticed his gaze falter toward the folded wedding dress within, its fabric yellowed but still carrying the faint luster of promises once made. Those objects unsettled him. She could see it in the taut line of his jaw, the way his eyes turned away quickly. They were reminders of a life he had no place in, a threshold he could never cross. It unsettled Clara as well. She felt caught between past and present, between loyalty to a memory and the strange gravity that now bound her days. The silence between her and Takoda grew sharper, edged with things unsaid. One evening, the strain broke. Supper had been meager, only broth and bread, and the storm outside raged fierce. Takoda lingered by the door, his shoulders rigid, as if he meant to leave into the night. Something in Clara snapped. "You pace like a man with secrets," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "If you mean to bring trouble here, better you leave it behind my door." Her words hung in the air, jagged and cold. Ahyv set down her cup, her eyes flicking between them. Takoda's mouth tightened, but he did not answer. Instead, he turned his face away, the firelight catching on the scar that cut across his cheek. It was Ahyv who broke the silence, her voice steady, low, carrying a weight that stilled the storm inside the room. She told Clara of betrayal among their own, of a wound not of the flesh but of the spirit. Their people had searched not for conquest, not for revenge, but for a man of courage and truth to restore what had been broken. Takoda had once been counted among them, but treachery had cast him out, abandoned him to a half-life on the border, belonging nowhere. "He is not a fugitive," Ahyv said softly. "He is a man wronged. Cast aside by his own, mistrusted by yours. Still he stands." Clara sat frozen, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She had not expected such words, nor the quiet dignity with which they were spoken. Her eyes flicked to Takoda, who remained silent, his jaw set, as though he would rather bear suspicion than speak of his own pain. And in that silence, Clara felt something shift inside her. She saw the hollow in him that matched her own, the emptiness left by abandonment, the loneliness carved by rejection. She thought of nights spent by the window waiting for a husband who never returned, of years spent feeding the stove with nothing but memory to keep her warm. Takoda's silence was not unlike hers. His exile mirrored her widowhood. Both of them had been left to survive on scraps of memory and endurance. The fire cracked, sending sparks upward. For the first time in years, Clara felt her sharpness soften, not into trust yet, but into recognition. In Takoda's silence, she saw her own reflection. In Ahyv's confession, she glimpsed the fragile chance that perhaps survival did not have to mean only endurance. Perhaps it could mean dignity regained, wounds acknowledged, lives bound not by suspicion but by quiet, unspoken strength. She turned her face back to the fire, the braid Ahyv had woven the night before still brushing against her shoulder, as though to remind her of the human touch she had nearly forgotten. The silence that followed was no longer jagged, but deep, heavy with the weight of two souls carrying scars that might, in time, fit together. The night began in silence, the kind that settles heavy on snowbound land, broken only by the groan of the wind along the eaves. Clara had dozed lightly in her chair by the stove, a shawl pulled around her shoulders, when the sudden clamour of hooves reached her ears. At first she thought it was only her mind playing tricks, the old memories returning, the night she had sat waiting for her husband. But then came the voices, harsh and low, carried on the wind. The smell of smoke followed, sharp and choking. She rose, heart pounding, and moved to the window. Out in the darkness, flames leapt high from the barn, painting the snow in wild orange. Shadows of men moved against the firelight, their torches burning, rifles gleaming as they shouted. She caught fragments, fugitive, Indian, witch widow, words sharpened with hate. The door burst open. Takoda was already there, his knife flashing in hand, his body taut as a bowstring. Ahyv pressed against the wall, eyes wide, clutching a small hatchet. Clara did not think, did not pause. She reached for her husband's rifle where it hung, her hand steady though her heart thundered. A decade of solitude, of swallowed grief, seemed to boil up in her blood. This was her home. No man, no mob, would drive her from it. The fight came fast and brutal. Two men rushed the cabin, and Takoda met them with a ferocity that startled even Clara. He moved like a storm breaking over the plains, his blade striking true, his fists shoving one back into the snow. Clara lifted the rifle, the wood familiar against her cheek, and fired once, the crack shattering the night. One torch fell, hissing into the drift. But they kept coming. Shadows against the blaze, curses on their tongues, hatred in their eyes. Clara fired again, the recoil jarring her bones, the air thick with smoke. Ahyv shouted in her tongue, swinging her hatchet at a man who broke through the doorway. The cabin filled with struggle, firelight flickering over every desperate motion. In the chaos, Clara felt herself shoved hard to the floor. She gasped, turning to see a man raising his blade above her. Before the strike fell, Takoda was there. He threw himself between her and the blow, the knife cutting deep into his shoulder. His body shielded hers, his breath harsh against her ear as he staggered with the impact. For a moment, time held still, the firelight etching his face in stark lines, courage burning raw and unflinching in his eyes. Clara did not hesitate. She lifted the rifle again and fired at the man who had struck him. The intruder fell, the smoke and gunpowder stinging her eyes. Around them, the others faltered, the fire of their hatred dimming as fear took hold. One by one, they fled into the night, their torches scattering like stars against the snow. The barn roared behind them, flames consuming what years of labor had built, but the house stood, and they still breathed. When the last hoofbeats faded, silence fell once more, broken only by the crackle of burning wood outside and the ragged breaths of those who remained. Clara dropped the rifle and turned to Takoda. Blood soaked his sleeve, bright against the pale glow of lantern light. She led him to a chair, her hands trembling as she pressed cloth to the wound. The lantern flickered, throwing long shadows across the walls, the air heavy with smoke and the sharp tang of blood. Her fingers shook, not only from fear but from something deeper, something long denied. She had tended wounds before, scrapes, cuts, the injuries of a ranch life, but never with this weight in her chest, never with her heart so unguarded. Takoda watched her, his face pale, his jaw clenched against the pain. When she bound the wound tight, her hand lingered a moment too long on his arm, her eyes unwilling to leave his. He whispered then, his voice halting, his English broken but clear enough. "Thank you," he said. The words struck her deeper than the gunfire had. She could not answer, not with words. Instead, her silence filled the space, thick with the tears she would not let fall, the ache she had carried for 10 long years. In that silence was more than gratitude. It was a stirring of something she thought long dead, the fragile tenderness of a woman who could still give, still receive, still love. Outside, the barn smoldered, the smoke rising into the winter sky. Inside, beneath the lantern's glow, Clara realized she was no longer only a widow guarding the ashes of what had been. She was alive again, her heart unsteady but beating with fierce, undeniable life. Spring came like a hesitant promise, the snow retreating into the folds of the hills, the earth softening under the sun. The thaw carried both relief and dread. With it came whispers drifting on the wind, word that Takoda's pursuers were riding again, more numerous, more determined than before. The raid in winter had not been the end, only a reprieve. Takoda felt it first, in the restlessness that stole his sleep. He sharpened his knife until the edge glimmered white, mended the horse's tack, gathered what little he could carry. He would not let the storm fall on Clara again. His place was on the road, hunted or forgotten, not within the fragile peace of her home. Clara knew before he spoke. She saw it in his eyes when he looked at her, something braced, something already leaving. And yet when he finally told her, his voice low, his words halting, she stood still in the doorway, shawl tight around her shoulders. Her silence was not consent. It was refusal. Another abandonment would hollow her to nothing. She had lived too long with ghosts. That evening she led him to the ridge, where the prairie opened wide and the wooden cross over her husband's grave leaned against the wind. The grass was still brittle, but small shoots pierced through, stubborn and green. She stood with Takoda there, her hand brushing the weathered wood as if touching both the man she had lost and the man beside her now. "I buried him here," she said at last, her voice carrying more weariness than tears. "I thought I buried myself with him. 10 years I kept house with silence, waiting for something I never named. You think you bring me danger, but you brought me breath." Takoda's gaze lingered on the horizon, the wind lifting his hair, his wound still bound beneath his shirt. At length, he spoke too, voice low, words carrying weight. He told her of betrayal, of kin who had cast him aside, of leaders who had branded him unworthy when he stood against treachery in his own camp. His exile had not been a choice, but a wound. "2 worlds," he said quietly, "and neither calls me son." She turned to him then, and in that silence they recognized each other, 2 souls marked by absence, by abandonment, yet still standing. The riders came at dawn. Dust rose before the sun cleared the ridge, the glint of rifles sharp against the new light. Clara's neighbors had gathered too, drawn by the promise of spectacle, of judgment. Whispers threaded through the crowd, the widow and the Indian. "She'll turn him over. She'll stand aside." But Clara did not step aside. She walked from her porch with her rifle steady in her hands, her back straight though her heart pounded. She stood shoulder to shoulder with Takoda, her shawl whipping in the wind. Every eye fixed on her, the woman who had kept to herself for 10 years, who had lived in quiet grief, and now she was seen. Not as a shadow, not as a widow lost to memory, but as a woman choosing her ground. The pursuers slowed, their certainty faltering at the sight. Takoda did not raise his weapon. He stood, silent but unflinching, his strength a stone in the storm. Clara's voice broke across the space between them and the riders, firm, unshaking. "You'll not take him here. Not while I draw breath." The moment stretched, taut as wire. The mob had come for conquest, but what they met was something they had no language for, a widow defiant, an outcast unbowed, and a town held witness. In that stillness, their will broke. One by one, the riders turned, their hooves carrying them back across the plains, their fire quenched not by blood but by something deeper, by the undeniable dignity of those who would not yield. Silence fell when the dust settled. Neighbors stared, then slipped away, unsettled, unwilling to name what they had seen. Clara lowered her rifle slowly, her hands trembling only after it was done. Later, When the sun slanted gold across the fields, Takoda saddled his horse. Ahyv climbed up behind him, her small hands clutching the worn leather. Clara stood at the edge of the yard, the air heavy with what could not be spoken. He did not ask her to come. She did not ask him to stay. Some paths, once crossed, could not be held. Yet as he looked down at her, the bond between them needed no words. Clara's heart ached, but it did not feel empty. She had known love's fire again, not the soft, imagined warmth of memory, but the fierce, living flame of courage shared in the storm. Her dignity was not borrowed from the past nor stolen by grief. It was hers, reclaimed. As Takoda and Ahyv rode into the horizon, their figures shrinking against the wide sky, Clara pressed her hand to her chest and whispered a prayer. Not of loss, not of longing, but of blessing. The land around her was still scarred, her barn gone, her years marked by sorrow, but she stood rooted in the soil of her choosing, alive to the wind, unafraid of the silence. For the first time in 10 years, she was not waiting for life to return. She was living it.